Welcome to the debate. Today, we are tackling a deeply sobering subject, the tragic crowd crush that occurred during the political gathering in Velusamipuram, Karur. It was an event that resulted in the devastating loss of 39 lives, including really tragically children and pregnant women.
It's a horrific event, and the scale of it just forces us to ask some really hard questions about where the most profound and perhaps most avoidable systemic failure happened.
Exactly. And that's our central question today. Was this fundamentally an institutional and governmental failure, characterized by maybe regulatory negligence, inadequate infrastructure provision, or was it primarily a failure of organizational negligence, poor logistical planning by the event host itself?
That's the core tension.
Driven by, I think, critical failures in managing very foreseeable risks and just basic event logistics.
And I'll be approaching it somewhat differently. While I certainly see that organizational errors contributed to the chaos, I'm going to contend that the catastrophe was, in a sense, fundamentally predetermined by a core institutional failure. Specifically, the governmental decision to approve what seems to have been an inherently unsafe and inadequate location, coupled with a real lack of necessary supportive infrastructure that just magnified the danger exponentially.
Okay, well, let's lay out the positions then. My position really centers on the organizing body's failure to grasp the sheer magnitude of the risk they were both creating and, frankly, compounding through their actions. For me, this tragedy was a direct result of logistical negligence, pure and simple. You just have to look at the timeline. The leader's announced arrival was noon, right? But they didn't actually arrive until 7:30 p.m., drastically late. This created a scenario where thousands of dedicated supporters, many we hear arriving as early as 3 p.m., were forced to wait for over 4.5 hours, standing, packed together, motionless in a tightly compressed space. Now, this extended, unmanaged delay, combined with, overwhelming reports from witnesses of insufficient or in some cases completely non-existent drinking water. This directly led to severe physical distress, dehydration, fatigue, breathlessness. People started collapsing. And these collapses, they were the immediate, tangible triggers for the deadly crash and the stampede behavior that followed. And maybe even more damningly, the organizers reportedly only secured permission for a maximum crowd of 10,000 people.
Right, that's the figure.
Yet they either permitted or just failed spectacularly to control a crowd estimated at over 30,000. I mean, a threefold capacity overrun in an already confined space. That demonstrates a profound failure to manage crowd flow. That's a critical organizational duty. This wasn't just a lapse. It feels like it was a conscious or unconscious decision to sacrifice safety for spectacle.
Okay, I understand that analysis, and it does highlight some really egregious errors in the, let's call it the execution phase. But I think it overlooks the foundational error that arguably made any execution impossible to manage safely. The stage for this disaster wasn't really set by the 7:30 p.m. arrival time, but I'd argue by the institutional decision made weeks earlier. The government sanctioned the use of a location described, and this figure is critical, as being only 1,000 square feet.
1,000 square feet?
Yes, I mean, for context, 1,000 square feet is roughly the size of a very small shop or maybe a small apartment space. To approve this tiny area for a major political event involving a public figure known to draw immense crowds, potentially tens of thousands, that demonstrates what I see as an unforgivable institutional breakdown in basic risk assessment. There was a witness assertion, which I think is critical, that the government should never have approved this site. That points to the sort of original sin of this tragedy, regulatory failure.
In compounding this, the state infrastructure seems to have been actively detrimental. The placement of these huge flex banners, for instance, reportedly only 3 meters from the road edge. That further constrained movement along an already narrow, unsuitable path. And the authorities also appear to have failed to account for highly predictable external factors. It was noted it was a Saturday, a payday, coinciding with school holidays. Some local companies even gave leave.
Right, predictable confluence.
Exactly. These factors demonstrably magnified the crowd size, yet the police presence and the security measures, according to reports we have, were just wholly inadequate to handle this predictable influx. So the government fundamentally sanctioned a spatial bottleneck and then, it seems, failed to staff it appropriately to manage the inevitable consequences. So look, I see why you prioritize the organizational fault, especially regarding exceeding the capacity limit. That's a clear failure. But let me offer a slightly different perspective, one rooted in systemic policy failure. We're discussing a location that, by expert accounts and just basic spatial reasoning, seems inherently inadequate. If your site approval mechanism allows an area the size of, a couple of small offices, 1,000 square feet, to be designated for an event that carries the known risk of drawing 30,000 or potentially even more people, well, then the systemic failure has to rest with the approving body, doesn't it? Once that intrinsically dangerous location was greenlit, arguably no amount of last-minute crowd control by the organizers could realistically prevent disaster when that many people showed up. It feels like a policy failure that creates an environment where operational failure becomes almost inevitable.
Well, I understand the appeal of simplifying the cause down to just the government approval, but I think that analysis lets the event host off the hook too easily regarding their active role in the fatality count. We absolutely have to hold the organizers accountable for managing the foreseeability of the risk. They were fully aware of their own leaders' drawing power. I mean, they even cited similar events held elsewhere that apparently proceeded without incident.
That's true.
So what was the difference? Presumably good organization in those other cases. This suggests the organization did have the capacity, or should have had the capacity, to mitigate these risks. Look, if the government issued a questionable permit for 10,000 people, okay, the organizers then had two primary duties. First, manage the crowd within that limit. That's basic. And second, if they knew, as they surely must have, that they would draw far more, then they had a responsibility to utilize one of the reportedly spacious and safer alternatives, like the Salem bypass area that was mentioned. Choosing a severely constrained area and then allowing 3 times the permitted capacity, that demonstrates a critical organizational choice to ignore safety protocols, regardless of what piece of paper the government initially signed off on. The government might have given them a box suitable for 10,000. They crammed 30,000 into it and then, crucially, failed to adequately supervise them or provide for their basic needs during that long wait. And let's pivot back to what I see as the most immediate trigger point, something directly controlled by the host body, that drastically late arrival at 7:30 p.m., and the, frankly, catastrophic lack of basic provisions, especially water. I'm arguing that this organizational delay was the true proximate cause because it fundamentally broke down the crowd's physical resilience. Just imagine waiting for hours and hours, from 3 p.m. onward, getting increasingly dehydrated, exhausted. The heat, the crush, the lack of water. This physically compromised statement that when even a minor disturbance slightly occurred, attendees were already too weak to remain standing. That's what leads to collapses, which then trigger the wider stampede. The host body, in my view, failed utterly to provide basic life support for the vulnerable crowd they invited, and then actively kept waiting for hours past the announced time. That's negligence regarding basic human welfare, not just, ticking a regulatory box.
I'm not quite convinced by that line of reasoning as the primary trigger, because while dehydration undoubtedly contributed to individual vulnerability, that's clear, it feels like the environmental chaos created by the structural failings on site was the definitive catalyst that turned that vulnerability into mass fatality. Yes, people were certainly tired, dehydrated, stressed, but what fundamentally shifted the situation from severe discomfort to fatal crushing seems to have been the power failure. Witnesses confirmed this. The generator room, which was placed far too close to the crowd, apparently, was compromised when people fell onto it and somehow severed the wires.
Okay.
This action plunged that already cramped, stressed area into complete darkness. Now, this sudden, disorienting loss of illumination, that's what seems to have initiated mass panic behavior. In the dark, people lost their footing, they started climbing trees or surrounding structures out of sheer fear, and then subsequently fell back into the compressed crowd, creating fresh pockets of mayhem and crushing. This catastrophic loss of sight was, I argue, a failure of secure infrastructure management, poor generator placement, maybe a lack of barriers, insufficient emergency lighting.
These are all elements the state authority should have guaranteed when approving and overseeing the event layout. So for me, the institutional failure to secure the environment is what created the conditions for the Stampede, perhaps more critically than just the physical exhaustion alone.
And that's a compelling point about the power failure, yes, but we also have to consider accessibility and external security more broadly, areas which generally fall squarely under state or police control. Several witnesses highlighted this. The 6 available streets that were meant for exiting the area were reportedly completely blocked by hundreds, maybe more, of parked two-wheelers.
Right, the parking issue.
Exactly. People desperately needed to leave because of the breathlessness, the exhaustion, all the conditions we've discussed, but they physically couldn't get out. This failure to secure clear egress points, to ensure clear pathways for maybe medical access or emergency dispersal, that points directly to a severe security and traffic management lapse by the authorities on site. That's a classic governmental function, ensuring public safety beyond just the immediate stage setup. Trapping an exhausted, potentially panicking crowd is a critical security failure that surely amplified the death toll significantly. Okay, but I would actually frame that egress failure slightly differently, perhaps tying it back again to organizational negligence, or at least shared responsibility. The organizational failure arguably began much earlier with the sheer number of vulnerable attendees allowed, or maybe not sufficiently discouraged from entering that tight area. We're talking pregnant women, children, the elderly, who perhaps should have been explicitly guided away from the most congested zones in a high-risk political rally like this. The organizations should have been far more diligent about the crowd composition, given the known spatial limitations they chose to operate within. Furthermore, the final failure in flow control, which exacerbated the blocked exits, occurred precisely when the leader's vehicle arrived. This arrival, a scheduled, organizational event, caused that immediate, inevitable surge toward the focal point.
A predictable surge, yes, absolutely predictable. And it scattered the already compromised crowd into those blocked exit streets, intensifying the crush. The organization was ultimately responsible, I believe, for mitigating that surge, for establishing clear, secure, unblocked viewing corridors or zones from the outset. Their failure to anticipate and control this predictable human reaction to the leader's arrival is, in my view, a key reason why the security perimeter, including those exit routes, collapsed, regardless of whose specific job it was, minute by minute, to manage the parked two-wheelers outside the immediate event zone. So in light of this discussion, I have to maintain that while the institutional oversight was, well, clearly flawed, significantly flawed even, the organizational failings were the direct, active choices or errors that escalated what was already a difficult situation into a truly catastrophic crush. The choice to permit or allow 30,000 people when only 10,000 were permitted, the organizational decision, conscious or not, to delay the arrival for hours, creating that long wait, and the critical failure to provide basic human necessities like water. These were all errors the organizers actively made or failed to correct. These choices place vulnerable people into an utterly untenable situation, making them physically incapable of surviving the subsequent chaos.
And I would circle back and argue that the fundamental, necessary error, the one that made all subsequent failures more likely, if not inevitable, rested with that institutional approval of a fundamentally inadequate 1,000 square foot space. The resulting infrastructure failures, like the narrow ingress and egress points, the detrimental placement of those flex banners, the inadequate lighting and security which led to the power cut panic, and the failure of authorities to maintain clear traffic flow around the perimeter. These provided an almost impossible environment for any event manager to control once the predictably large crowd arrived. The institutional framework, in my view, created the lethal bottleneck from the very beginning.
It's clear this terrible event tragically demonstrates that safety planning can't just be a checklist item. It has to be a mandated, robust, and genuinely ethical priority at absolutely every level of event execution and organizational behavior.
Indeed. The sheer complexity of this tragedy really highlights a necessity of absolute diligence and, crucially, much better coordinated planning between political organizations, event organizers, and the state authorities responsible for public safety
to prevent such devastating loss of life in the future. There is certainly much more to explore here, particularly in how regulatory policy absolutely must be tightened to address these clear failures in both site approval processes and the management of crowd dynamics.